Well, shall we introduce ourselves briefly?
Sure.
I'll introduce myself and then you can say something. And
Okay.
I have 9 questions, which we may not get all to, but.
All right, bless you.
So
Tell me about yourself.
So I will just say about myself that I am Amy Carr. I'm a professor of religious studies at Western Illinois University. I'm a Lutheran theologian. I don't primarily work on ecological questions, but I have gotten to know your daughter Heather because I write lectionary commentaries 2 to 4 times a year for the Lutherans Restoring Creation website. And I've also just written my first batch of ELCA creation, Connection to Creation briefs for Sundays and Seasons.
Wow.
So I have been really enjoying thinking about, applying a green eye to the lectionary readings. Quite the challenge to do that. It's a really creative challenge. So I'll have a few questions for you that will reflect some of what I've been thinking about as I read those. But for the most part, my interest is in kind of drawing out some of your thought for somebody who's not read you.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So did you want to say a little bit about yourself first?
Well, my first book, and this was in 1970, Brother Earth in 1970. And I did my doctoral dissertation on Karl Barth and nature. And that sort of set me off in the theological direction. And then along the way, I discovered that there was something called an environmental crisis. It was some popular books and so forth, and began to work on this step by step. And then I realized that I had sort of inadvertently backed into the field of the future. That this is where the world was going at. And so theology had to do this. And I suppose my one major angle was to make sure that people who are working on this in the churches knew their history and knew what was going on in terms of who were the good guys and the bad guys, and mostly guys they were, who had addressed questions of nature and creation and justice. And so that was the sort of the writing theological side of my existence. Well, I was also a practicing pastor for all these years, and began at Wellesley College and was there for 13 years or so. It was the same time that Hillary Clinton was there, and it was the 60s. And then I began to pull the academic and the pastoring together because we were involved in activism, and different kinds of things in those days. And from there, I went to an inner city church. And I've always had this in the back of my mind. What would the parishioners in my inner city church think about what I'm saying? And so hence the issue of justice was always really important to me. And the last thing I'll say is that the thing that tied my dissertation together with my practical engagement in this field was really the German resistance to Hitler. That Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a key figure for me that to show me how theology really addresses the issues that the church is dealing with for the day. So that's sort of an introduction to one side of my existence.
Okay, so you've practiced theology from the context of ministry.
That's right. That's right.
And so would you say, now I'm going to add to my 9 questions, but
Okay.
Would you say that Dietrich Bonhoeffer provided inspiration for you, or have you drawn on his approach theologically or ethically in thinking about ecological questions?
Well, all of the above, but mainly his understanding that he enunciated in his commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, that and the challenge of obedience and following Jesus. And so that was really at the heart of my grasping of Bonhoeffer. And then, if I may, another key figure was a Lutheran, Joseph Sittler, who started talking about a cosmic Christ. Because unless God is the Redeemer of the whole world, God isn't really the Redeemer. And so I somehow began to fuse Bonhoeffer's Christ, whom you follow as a disciple, with Sittler's vision of Christ who holds everything together. And so that's sort of the continuing challenge of my theological life, to hold those two together.
And actually, one of my questions was, what are some of your favorite theologians to think with? So I think you've been addressing that. But I have found, so I studied at the University of Chicago for my doctorate, worked with Bernard McGinn a fair bit, and read a lot of the patristics and medieval thinkers with him. And of course, before the Renaissance, a cosmocentric worldview was more common among Christian theologians, among the intellectuals. And one of the things I really liked is the 2nd century writer Irenaeus and his rebuke of the Gnostics. And I'm sure you've seen this kind of passage. I thought about it in what you just said about Joseph Sittler, the idea that the incarnation isn't just about God becoming human in Jesus, but ultimately about God becoming grain and grape, right? And the bread and the wine, right? And so has the incarnation then, sounds like it's been central to your ecological theology.
Yes, insofar as I've been able to hold together that personal obedience theology with the cosmic vision. And Irenaeus, as a matter of fact, was one of the thinkers that I studied in my book, The Travail of Nature. There's a chapter on Irenaeus in that book. And I have the good guys and the bad guys, so to speak, and Irenaeus is one of the good guys.
So who are the bad guys besides the Gnostics?
It's those who lean in the Gnostic direction. And in a way, this may shock you, Karl Barth was one of those, because he, not a Gnostic, but he viewed theology as theanthropology. That is, theology is the doctrine of God and man, as he said, and particularly with the incarnation. And that took form in the world, mainly in terms of church. And although Barth had a vigorous theology of creation, I argue that it was secondary to his main interest, and indeed was vulnerable to being misinterpreted by those who wanted to be simply theanthropocentric or basically anthropocentric, and not deal with the world of nature, which is God's creation, and for which God has God's own purposes. God has God's own purposes. It's one of the main points in my book, The Travail of Nature, that the ecological motif in Christian thinking with Irenaeus and the later Augustine, and then in their own ways, Luther and Calvin, was really comprehended God, humanity, and whole of creation. So that's been my framework for interpreting Christian theology for some time.
So what I'm picking up is that in kind of your big theological ideas, it's been placing Christology in a cosmocentric perspective.
That's right.
And noticing how in various theological thinkers that kind of care for creation is infused and can be retrieved and highlighted. And then on the other side, there's this kind of ethical mandate that's practical. Right. And so I may come back and ask you a little more about that. But I want to stay on these kind of bigger picture theological questions for a minute and share with you one of the questions that I feel haunted by. Thinking about, there's sort of two directions this question can come from, and I pose a naturalistic version of it to one of my friends, Eric Bach, who teaches evolutionary plant biology at Luther College. But a Christian eschatological imagination can be dangerous. Think about Matthew 24:35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Right? So Jesus saying that. So the awareness of the mortality of the stars and the planets, right? And again, if you just look at that with our understanding of the history of the universe now, you can pose this question from a Christian perspective and from a naturalistic perspective. Why care for the earth if it will eventually pass away? And why care for the earth if God in Christ is going to renew it anyway in a new creation? So I'm sure you've thought about that. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Where to begin? It's one of the key pieces is how you understand who God is. Is God the biblical God from Genesis to Mark, Romans 8, and Colossians, or is God the God who is not too useful in the Old Testament and who is the one who gives us gnosis, and who, and particularly for Lutherans who are so, I was about to say hung up, but who are so concerned with justification by faith, that, by the way, has been another ongoing critique my whole theological life, is to introduce Lutherans to Luther and to the scriptures in a new way, because those Lutherans who know only justification by faith really are not able to answer the kind of question that you're talking about. And what I prefer to do is to read the scriptures narratively and to begin with Genesis 1 and 2. And it's important to see Genesis 1 as God's purposes for the whole creation. God wanted a world to bring to completion. And Genesis 2, particularly about why was Adam put in the garden? And the standard translation for that is to till and to keep it. Well, the Hebrew actually says to care for it. And there's been a lot of good research in the last 20, 40 years about those texts, that Adam is a creature of the earth. So if you read Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 together, as Moltmann, Jürgen Moltmann has done so successfully, as the beginning of a story, as the underlying meaning of the story of the whole creation, the billions and billions and billions of galaxies, then we have a framework that's commensurate with the natural scientific view of the world. Not that people will believe it, but it's commensurate with that. It's just not talking about my salvation or my knowing or my wisdom or how I get through the day. It's a vision of cosmic history. What was the question? I was trying to think that.
So clearly, part of human purpose is to have stewardship of care for the earth. That's in both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. So the world matters for human existence, and we matter for the world's existence. Is that one of the?
Yes and no. I've been a critic, along with a number of others like Larry Rasmussen and so forth, of the stewardship doctrine. I don't use the word stewardship. Haven't used it for years. The ELCA statement on the Earth crisis doesn't use the word stewardship. Pope Francis only uses the word stewardship once in his whole Laudato Si. Something's going on here, and that's because stewardship essentially is a management idea rather than a caring and loving idea, that you are in my control. I learned this way back when I was at Wellesley College, that most women I know do not want to be managed, right? And so that stewardship is something we probably want to set aside. I work with it because it's the best thing we got going, but I think it needs to be transformed and reinterpreted, and probably not used because it's used by ExxonMobil and a whole bunch of other folks who use it in a variety of different ways.
This is reminding me of conversations with my own father years ago, because he taught in a 2-year forest technology program. And so the 4-year forestry students would be learning how to manage forests, and the 2-year folks would be learning how to go out and do the technical work in the field. And so, yes, there was lots of conversations about what a well-managed forest looks like, right? And of course, this taps into much larger conversations about the relationship between a wilderness-oriented perspective, pro-wilderness perspective, and a green technology. There's places for that. And so I think I could certainly see there's lots of ways to understand. You could translate stewardship into something that's about recognizing our responsibility and care for the earth, right? Our responsibility. But the question that I had originally was thinking about the eschatological imagination, and how there's so much that emphasizes the mortality of creation. Like, I'm thinking about how when I'm working on the lectionaries, that there's all this emphasis on the Psalms and the prophets on personifying the natural world, right? The trees clap their hands in praise of God. You can't talk about lamentation or justice without talking about how the earth is feeling, right? How is the land doing? We're always worlded. We ourselves are always worlded. But that world itself, there's these various points in Scripture that point to its own mortality. And so yes, that was the question. Why care for the earth if God in the Christ is going to be renewing it anyway? Why focus on worrying about the climate crisis?
Well, that's the same difference. Why care for your neighbor?
Yeah, sure, you're right.
And ashes to ashes and dust to dust. So one has to take one's marching orders from the whole biblical narrative, that God has a purpose for all things, a loving purpose for all things. To bring humans into community, but to also minister to the whole of nature. And in this view, the book of Job is as important in the Hebrew Bible as the Exodus story. That the Exodus story is not the whole story, but it's the revelation of what God is doing in the whole world. That is to save the whole world and reaffirm the whole world.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One more particular question, and then I want to come back to some more open-ended ones.
Okay.
And this again is a question I find myself thinking about, and as I listen to you and thinking about your working as a pastor, I imagine you will say it depends on the person, but I guess thinking theologically in your own thought, and then thinking about activism as Christians, how do we balance fostering, I'm really quoting myself here, fostering spiritual attention to ecocide with fostering attention to pragmatic responses to climate crisis, like developing green technologies? So I'm thinking about how there's this on kind of thinking about like the lament side, the spiritual awareness side. Like Sharon Delgado has this image of the last frog of a particular species croaking for a mate, right? And never finding it. It's a really haunting image. And I see some sides of like spiritual writers focusing on that. And I might put that in the prophetic tradition, right? Of naming what's going on. But then the idea of responding to the climate crisis is much more practical, right? And
well, I would sort of expand what you just said about the prophetic tradition, because you not only have lament, but you have Second Isaiah and the renewal of the land as the chosen people move toward Jerusalem, or in the Book of Revelation, which maybe can bring us full circle to this notion of apocalypticism being destructive. The Book of Revelation has this vision of the city with the renewal of the whole creation. It's not just renewal of me, not just a renewal of those in the know, the Gnostics. It's not just a renewal of the human creation, but of the whole creation. So that it's always important, it seems to me, to have the whole story in view, the Genesis to Revelation story, even, for example, in the Gospel of Mark. And this is hermeneutically significant, because if you have the whole story in view, and Moltmann does this in a glorious way, I'm doing it sort of get through the day way. If you have the whole story in view, then you're going to look not only at Colossians 1:15, but you're going to look at at Jesus in the Gospel of Mark brought into the wilderness. Now that's usually seen as a testing. I don't think that's the way to read it. That Mark has a creation theology going here, that Jesus is in a sense, the new Adam. He's in the wilderness, and this then comes later on in the Gospel of Mark, where this same Jesus stills the waters, and the disciples say, "Who then do you say that I am?" There's this hovering vision of Jesus as the inaugurator, the second Adam of a new creation, and who is the presence of the Creator God here before us, embodied in our experience. So I think the evangelicals have done a lot to give Christianity a bad name, particularly in terms of eschatology, and that anybody who talks about new heavens and new earth sounds like an evangelical, sounds like there's going to be a destruction, and lifts up those texts, one of which you mentioned to me, heaven and earth will pass away. What do Christians care anyway? Heaven and earth is going to pass away. So we have to constantly counter that. The tendency, I don't think this is a new thought, but it sounds new to me. The human tendency is to become Gnostic. That's part of our sinfulness, to want to let those other things go, those ugly creatures, to let those wrong kind of people, there's the good people and the bad people, to let the people who are not elected go, and to separate things out, and then end up with me and my few who are in the know be saved. And we constantly have to fight that in the name of Scripture, I think. He says.
So it sounds in a way like by focusing on the whole story, you're remembering that even as there's a new creation that's ultimately at God's initiative, we're still participants in it as we were in Genesis 1.
Precisely. So it's a recapitulation and a further fulfillment of Genesis 1 and 2.
And so our obligation is to attune to the Word of God, right? To attune to our responsibilities in caring for that and practicing justice with regard to the earth as our neighbor as well.
That's right. And not to think that we're going to save the world. The world's going to be saved by God, has been saved by God, but God gives us a calling in the midst of this history. We each have this calling. We each have a vocation to respond to the kairos, to the number kairos that God gives each one of us. And so where we are, where we find ourselves, what the challenges that each one of us is looking at, that's what God wants us to attend to, rather than worrying about whether the whole world's going to hell or not, but to do what we can, because he's got God's got the whole world in God's hands, but he's got the whole world in his hands, okay?
So that's a way you might respond to somebody who's in a despairing state looking at climate crisis too.
Right. I mean, I have a friend, a Swedish theologian, his name is Panu Pikala, whose special area of expertise is climate despair. And there's a lot of discussion going on in various segments about that, but he's in the midst of it and in a European setting, and he really believes that that's at least for him, the way he needs to take hold of the rug. My father said once, when you take hold of the rug, you take hold of the whole rug. Well, he thinks you have to take hold, he wants to take hold of the rug in terms of climate anxiety and deal with that and address that. So we each have our own callings and our own niche, and we all don't have to do everything. How did I get off onto this sermon?
It was good. And so it sounds like vocation and calling are key words in your thought, not so much participation in the work of God's renewal and sons of creation, but vocation is really key.
Yes, precisely.
That would fit with the Bonhoefferian theme as well.
Yeah, that's, thank you for saying this. I'm not sure if I understood that fully, although the woman, Kiara Jorgensen, you know her.
Yes.
She wrote a book on vocation, by the way, a very good book. And she identifies me precisely as you have, as one who's interested in really holding tight the theology of vocation as a way of holding this all together. So I'm read well by you and by she.
Well, I'm reading you from this conversation because I'm going to, when you wrote your first book, I was 3 years old. Or when you got it published, I was 3. But you know, I mean, when I think that, you know, my own green imagination, if we were to use this term now, was probably sparked in Vacation Bible School with LCA materials right after Earth Day. That seemed to shape how the VBS materials are presented. And I remember distinctly being, you know, 5 or 6 and seeing on the cover of these Vacation Bible School little booklets like pictures of lions and other animals, and kind of the lion will lie down with the lamb, and the whole theme was different creatures of God. And I can't help but think that whoever put together that material was doing so in part in the context of Earth Day.
Yeah, I think the American Lutherans have been very, very good by and large on this. Not necessarily the American Lutheran theologians, but the churches. And I have looked at our outdoor ministries as really another teaching arm of the church.
Yes.
That not just Holden Village, but places like that that have insinuated themselves into the curriculum making and given you some crazy ideas, which I happen to think are true. So I think Lutherans have probably been pretty good on this across the board. And the first ELCA statement, Lutherans led it way back when, and with the one in 1993.
Yeah, well, if you have, I have a few more questions. I don't know if we need to stop right at 3:30, but
go ahead.
Let me share them with you. And I guess you think you've shared most of your, if there are other parts of your theological ideas, first of all, that you would want to share with somebody who's never read your works. I think you've given us a pretty good sense, but anything else?
I think I've touched the main thing that
Okay.
I think a biblical narrative, reading with through the lens of creation history, paying attention to wilderness themes, to renewal of earth themes, and really taking seriously that the Bible is a story of Alpha and Omega in a very positive sense.
When you talk about the good guys versus the bad guys,
Yeah.
is the gist of that, the bad way of reading it is that Gnostic way, or that way that leads us to focus on individual soul salvation? Would that be the broad way you would distinguish the theologian you find productive to work with, or the strands of theology you find productive to work with?
Okay, if I were having a beer with you, I would say yes. But if that has to be nuanced, because there's a whole bunch of people who focus on the inner life, history of spirituality, and they're not among the bad guys. They may not have concentrated so much on the whole narrative, and they have things to share and to offer the rest of us. And so it needs to be nuanced, and that's why we need many vocations and many points of view to utter a Catholic theology.
Catholic theology, lowercase c.
Yes.
All right. Last two questions. What are any questions that abide with you that you continue to wrestle with theologically, if any? Maybe your approach is to sort of have a vision of the whole and just see everything having a voice or a place. But are there questions that you're living with?
Would you believe whether the world is going to hell? That is to say, with this large, hopeful narrative shaping my theology, I also want to deal with radical evil, and even with the demonic as part of this story. I was a student of Paul Tillich for many years, and Tillich talked a lot about the demonic, and there are forces that we don't understand, operative in our world, which may take command of human history. I don't want to say that those are the same forces that are behind the galaxies and the black holes and all the rest of that, but particularly in human history, we know very little about the devil. We know very little about the demonic. It is close to non-being, Tillich would say, but it's real. And any theologian worth his or her salt, I think, has to come to terms, at least by saying I can't come to terms with radical evil. And, Reinhold Niebuhr was also one of my favorite theologians on the way up, and still is. And he got in lots of trouble with his liberal friends by talking about original sin. And I think one of the gifts that Christian theology has to bring to the general intellectual discussion is the discussion of radical evil, original sin, however you call that, human brokenness. Because unless we come to terms with this, and unless we're wrestling with this, we're either going to slip off into some sort of a hopelessness, or we're going to deny it and just have an optimistic kind of worldview, none of which is good, frankly, for dealing with ourselves in the current crisis. We have to hold both these things. We have to be creatures of hope while we're well aware of the powers of evil.
Yes, and I'm sure you've already reframed the whole law-gospel dynamic in those terms too, right? Law interrupting our presumption that everything's okay, and then the gospel preventing our despair. And
that I do not myself, I have not myself over the years dealt much with the rhetoric of law and gospel. Part of it is that the way it has been formed historically has tended toward an anthropocentrism, that is, how am I to be saved? rather than a cosmocentrism. How is the world to be saved? And law and gospel doesn't really work for the creatures of Job, because there's no sinfulness in nature. There's brokenness, there's suffering, but the lion did not sin before the lion attacks the lamb. The lion is the lion.
So when you talk about radical evil and the demonic, you're not talking then about human sin necessarily. You're talking.
That's included. That's included. That's an expression of somehow, which we don't understand, or at least I don't understand, of radical evil coming and taking ourselves captive, so that we can't do anything but sin.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I were talking to a reporter from the New York Times, I would not say it that way, but that we always end up on the wrong side of things. Things tend to go wrong when us humans are involved in it, even though we have great hope and we've done some marvelous things in human history.
So you stand in the Augustinian tradition like Niebuhr and Luther in that regard.
Yes, absolutely. But again, as a footnote, and I hope I may have persuaded you, if you needed persuading, that we need to be, as Lutherans, be very careful about law gospel discussions.
It can be opened up and enriched in a lot of different ways, right? We have to ask what we mean by those things.
Yes.
I tend to think that much of our polemics these days is about debating the nature of the moral law and forgetting all about justification by faith. But I certainly appreciate that those things need to be de-anthropocentrized, right? Need to be made more broad. I'm tempted to ask you if you thought about, well, yeah, I will. Then I have one more question.
Okay.
But when you were speaking about radical evil, I sort of cycled back to Barth and thought, well, you know, Barth talks about how whether the earth is entering hell, right? Thinking about how Barth's theology of sovereignty and predestination says we're all predestined to damnation and then to salvation. I'm wondering if you've thought about your abiding question in relationship to that.
I've thought about it. In ancient days, I met with Karl Barth once in Germany, and he told me I shouldn't be writing a dissertation on nature. That was his.
Really? Why?
Well, you know, the whole Barthian thing of natural theology and nature theology really being tied up with a certain kind of German triumphalism. That there are many theologians of Barth's time who are more than happy to talk about the riches of nature in terms of the Übermensch and in terms of the rise of the white race to rule over everything. So that that had to be really addressed very, very straightforwardly and head on.
So that interruptive revelatory word of God in Barth, right, is very, very important there.
Precisely.
Yeah, no, so that is interesting to sort of think about how eco-theological work is like and unlike the natural theology of that sort. Yeah.
That's right.
But yeah.
Do keep that history in mind, that it helps us to understand Barth, why he appeared to be so opposed to natural theology. But it also raises question, are some of our current thinkers about nature being captive to a viewpoint that doesn't take justice into account? In other words, are the German nature theologians sort of coming in by the back door in some forms of naturalism in the U.S., I think I don't think that's a clear and present danger, but I think it's a question that we want to have in mind.
Well, it sounds to me like what you're saying here can be part of your response to my last question, because it sounds like you want to keep surfacing how sin and radical evil fit into conversations about ecotheology, and not just in the simplistic sense of we've been thoughtless and mindless and how we overuse the world's resources and so on, but getting to this kind of deeper metaphysical question. So my last question is really, what might Christians and other people of faith contribute to addressing climate crisis that those without a faith perspective might not contribute? Or is that an unhelpful question?
No, I think it's worth thinking about. It may sharpen our own sense of calling. First thing that comes to mind is from the Bible, from Moltmann, is the theology of hope. In other words, that it's the Christian contingent, when they're of a right mind, who gets up in the morning and says, okay, now what are we going to do? Even though there's been huge disappointments yesterday, because we don't have to save the world, but we do have a calling to do what we can in our particular kairos that God is giving us. Now, what was your question again?
You're already answering it. What might Christians and other people of faith, or in this case, let's say people with the notion of God, right? What might we contribute to addressing climate crisis that those without a faith perspective might not contribute? And one thing you've just suggested is that there's a basis for hope.
Yeah, it's not only Christians who have this, but the Christians who need to cultivate this, because this is our identity. You know, come hell or high water, we have hope. I was just on a call not too long ago with Bill McKibben, and you know, for someone who knows the name and address of what's going wrong with the world, he's at the forefront, but he's constantly getting up in the morning and say, okay, now what are we going to do today to respond to God's call to me? I mean, he's a good Methodist boy. He's thinking those terms. What am I going to do today? What opportunities is God giving me? What am I not seeing? I think to that degree, Christians have, when we've got it together, or God's got it together for us, that we have something that can be exemplary and a hope in itself. Why do you guys keep coming back to this? It's so discouraging. No?
Mm-hmm. And then a frame of reference that can absorb all the different layers of questions is what I'm also hearing, right? Radical evil, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, can respond to them, can say, we have engaged these seriously.
Yes.
We may not have the answers, but we are working on it, and we'll tell you how we're working on it. We don't have answers about radical evil. We don't have answers about lots of things, but we are working on things that our community brings us together and helps us to have the vision that permits us to work on those things. So you're very kind to ask me all these
oh,
questions.
Well, thank you.
I love talking about these things, as you can.
I know I was intentionally trying not to learn too much more about your thoughts so I could just draw them out, but now I'm looking forward to reading more. Anything else you wanted to share, or shall we?
No, I just want to wish you well in your own vocation. I mean,
thank you.
You are a really smart cookie, and you are really engaging with important stuff. And I'm most grateful for your work with the lectionary. You know, I think that LRC is one of the best kept secrets in ministry in the U.S. There's a number of groups like LRC and Methodist and Episcopalian. Mm-hmm. I think there's a groundswell of mainly young people who are working on these issues behind the scenes, so to speak. They know who each other are, they communicate, and LRC is one of them, and also one of the best, I think.
I think so from what I have seen as well. And I'm really glad that there are scientists, Lutheran scientists engaged as well. You know, it's one of those few places that really brings together people who earnestly want to address something. And so you've got the spectrum of folks who want to think about the kind of abstract theological ideas, and also the people who want to do the concrete, what can we do congregationally as activists, as engineers, the whole spectrum. So.
Okay, well, thank you, and I wish you well. And